Hey, cool kids. Welcome into this week's episode of the Cool Grandpa Podcast. Before we get started, I want to remind you that I have been putting this podcast up over on YouTube. So there's video of me and the guests and our interactions back and forth. So you can go over there and check that out. If you happen to enjoy just kind of watching some of the podcasts on YouTube and watching the video interaction. If you do that, please remember to like and subscribe to that channel. It's a great way for us to help get into those algorithms and help really be able to communicate the important role of grandfathers to a wider audience. Now, this week we have Dr. Ed Stevens. Dr. Stevens is coming to us from the Foundation for Male Studies. Now, what's going to be great here is we're not only going to learn about Dr. Stevens' past, about how he got involved with learning and studying men's mental health issues. We are going to also be able to learn a little bit more about his own personal struggles, his challenges, his opportunities, and how that really has played a role into him being an advocate for men. Now, part of what he is doing is being able to talk to us about postpartum depression within men, and something that really hasn't been studied too much, but something that I think gets more and more recognition as we go on. So this is going to be a fabulous conversation with Dr. Stevens. You're really going to enjoy it, and you're going to learn an awful lot about men's mental health. So without further ado, let's jump into this conversation. Hi, Ed. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm excited to have you on today.
Hello, Greg. I am excited to be here.
You must be my about 10th guest from the White Plains, New York City, New York area that's on. There's something going on with grandfathers up in that area.
Yes, we have Jumpstart for Dads and Grandfathers United and a whole bunch of things.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar with the Grandfathers United, those guys over there, and fantastic organization. Now, I would love for you to give us a little bit of an introduction and some background information about where you went to school and how you decided to become a medical doctor and then a psychiatrist.
All right. Well, I had, I'd say, a varied beginning. I grew up rather traditionally in a little Irish Catholic family in New Jersey, always wanting to be a doctor. After trying a few other things, I finally got into medical school in Ireland, where I went to school in 1962 to 1967. And I got my medical degree then. And so I've been a physician for 57 years. And I've been a psychiatrist for 54 years. Where did I get my education? Well, when people would ask me where I learned what I know to be a psychiatrist, I would tell them, here in this office, talking to people. So I went to school, but I learned how to do it by talking to people.
Sure. I think that's always one of those, you start learning and then it's like, well, wait a second, I should probably get some real training behind what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, the real training was just being with everyone. I began to call myself a family psychiatrist after so many years because I worked with children who became adolescents, young adults who married, who had children, who brought their children to me. Then the children married, and we have the children that I worked with originally became grandparents, and I would see aunts and uncles. Seeing everyone in the family over the course of 54 years, I called myself a family psychiatrist.
Sure. Well, and that's got to give you some valuable insight if you're seeing kind of multi-generations within a family to understand maybe what some of the challenges are and what some of the aspirations are for the people that you work with.
Absolutely. You know, apropos of what we're doing here and focusing on, one of the things that I came across in my work over all the years was the absolute absence of concern for men's mental health. Actually, in 2006, I went to the American Psychiatric Association and requested that they create a committee on men's mental health because for 25 years, they had one on women's mental health. Yeah, they voted yes. They said yes, they'd do it. And then what happened was they sent it to committee. And you know what happens when things go to committees. All right. They sent it to die. So even at the American Psychiatric Association, they didn't have it. But what I discovered over the years was not just this lack of interest in men's health, but when I worked with the mothers and fathers and they had sons, they were always faced with this failure to launch. In other words, their young adult children, they didn't seem to be able to make it. And that's after all the difficulties they had in terms of learning in the primary grades and in high school. And, basically, I discovered through my research that boys are doing less well than girls at every age and stage in education, and actually emotionally, because for instance, 85% of the kids that are on psychostimulants are boys. Suicide rates among men of all ages, adolescent through adulthood, through the elderly, are 80%. Suicides are 80% male. Men die earlier from all causes than women. So I really began to experience the very, very special needs of boys and men in families, men in the workforce, men with depression. Because what I discovered was that men's way of presenting themselves is more or less unsympathetic. A woman comes in and she's depressed and she says, she's wringing her hands and she's crying. A man comes in and he says, my wife sent me here. She says, I'm grumpy and I'm drinking too much and I've been getting into fights. He's depressed as hell. If he didn't have then I might say to him, you must have a backache too. Yeah, my back's killing me. So these are, this is the way men present.
Right. When did you start to notice some of these changes, and when did you start to notice these things? I guess what year? Because you went to American Psychological Association in 2006.
American Psychiatric
Association. Yeah, but when did you start noticing it? Was it right when you were starting to become a family psychologist?
Well, it's interesting. In terms of my medical training, I started out in obstetrics and gynecology in 1966. I did 2 years in that field, and I delivered a whole bunch of babies, hundreds of babies. And what happened was that we had a lot of emotional turmoil in the mothers, and we would call psychiatric consultations. And when I heard what the psychiatrists were doing, and I saw the effectiveness of it all, I said, gee, I want to be a psychiatrist. So I switched to psychiatry. But when I really, really got to be involved with my understanding of men, because I was a feminist from probably 1970 until, 1994. But then in 1994, I had an epiphany. I got divorced. And I suddenly discovered I was a male. And everybody wanted to kill me. after they extracted the gold from my teeth. So the concept of having a really unique existence as a male, and difficulties as a man, difficulties as boys, difficulties as adolescents, difficulties as men. It grew on me over the years and crystallized in that period when I was getting a divorce. And so at that particular point, I put on a number of conferences on fathers and mothers after divorce. Where are we going? Because the father is still the father, the mother is still the mother, and the children are still the children of the father and mother. But after 3 years, I discovered through my work and my personal experience, the father gets disconnected from the children for various reasons. So then I discovered a plague of fatherlessness. And then I got further into another conference on myths in divorce. Really, basically, it's like the men somehow are all running off with their secretaries and, doing very nicely, and the women are impoverished. Well, the truth of the matter is that 7 out of 8 divorces are instituted by the women, and the men really are impoverished by it. And the third conference I put on back in the year 2000 was on the paternal instinct, because in all of this, and as all of this upheaval and discovery of myself as a man, I discovered in the separation that was being enforced between myself and my children that I had a real, what I call a paternal instinct. Everybody heard about the maternal instinct, but who knows from a paternal instinct? So I put on a conference on the maternal instinct. And from there, I went on to the creation of an entity called Male Studies and the Foundation for Male Studies, on the assumption that being male was worthy of study. I mean, after all, women's studies, gender studies, queer studies, I don't know, geology. Why not male studies? Why not a discipline that was centered on apolitical. This is very important because male studies is apolitical, academic, scientific understanding of all things male. What the lived experience of boys and men are at all ages and stages. And from there, I tumbled into research and whatnot. But I'll let you ask some more questions.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that jumps to mind is, my assumption has been that up until like, let's say the last 30, 40 years, most of medicine, most of psychology has been focused on men. And it seems like maybe just in the news articles and the headlines that it's, hey, we need more research for women's health, and we need more research for these things. And it's sounding like, hey, we need research for both, right? More detailed research and maybe not so much survey research. Is that right?
Well, you see, there have been waves of concern in this country. For instance, we had civil rights, then we had great gay rights, then we had the feminist movement. Wonderful, wonderful. But there was just one group that just never got mentioned and never got studied and never had advocacy. As a matter of fact, the studies in the other groups tended to see men as strange, difficult, problematic, and they just got left out. As I said, back in 2006, which is now almost 20 years ago, or it is 20 years ago, I had been working on this for quite a while, and I realized that in my own specialty of psychiatry, we just weren't meeting the needs of our boys and our men. And our society, our national societies, were geared to treatment of women, and the concerns were with women or with, I would say gender-based concerns. Gender is a funny thing, you mentioned gender, say, all right, we're going to have gender studies now. Well, now let's find out about all the women. Let's find out about all the trans. Let's find out about the LGBTQ. Gender studies. I didn't hear the word male mentioned. So this is where I came in. In 2015, I working with Charles Darwin, professor of anthropology from Rutgers University, Lyle Tiger. We put on a conference just for scholars, first class scholars across disciplines. We had about 10 people at a very small panel in the medical society offices in New York City. And it was fascinating to hear these people from across disciplines talking about their own personal experience, the experience in their departments, the experience in terms of the skewing of their research that was absent considerations around maleness. So it's something that's been developing, that started from my own kernel of experience, as I say, discovering myself as a male. And I think that what we're doing here, in some respects, is, I'm going to say, discovering maleness. And what's happening, and maybe what happened in our last election, was the country was discovering maleness because there was a great deal of discontent among the men. The men were voting for people that they felt would respond to them, would have their interest at heart, make work for them, make a place for them, and in many respects, save them from the discrimination of everybody comes before you. You're get to the end of the line, So I said, if we're going to walk on two legs, I like that imagery, because if you only have one leg, you hop. But if we're going to walk on two legs, we need to consider the concerns of males, boys and men, as well as those of women.
Sure. That makes total sense to me, making sure that we've got focuses and studies on what the unique attributes and needs are for these groups. What were some of the discoveries or findings where maybe you found with how boys and young men are treated, and maybe how we come up short with providing their needs to be met?
Well, one of my little excursions was to a residential treatment facility for adolescents, adolescent boys. one of the discoveries I made there, even though this is a treatment center for adolescent boys, and these boys, maybe they were failing in school, maybe they were discipline problems, maybe they were, getting a little wayward, and they were placed there under supervision in a mental health setting, really. But what I discovered was all the counselors were really focused on behavior. In other words, as Austin Powers says, behave yourself, behave yourself. So these young men are there in this situation that's supposedly going to help them in a rounded way. And really, they're being asked to follow the rules. Now, I suppose if you go into the Army and you follow the rules, you come out, a little straighter than when you went in. But these kids had other problems. Most of them were depressed. And the behavioral problems that we saw, either in their peer groups where they struggled and they fought, or they had trouble following the rules, came from depression. But depression wasn't even part of the active curriculum dealing with depression. It was behave yourself. So, and this was only maybe 15 years ago that I saw this. But long before that, as a psychiatrist, I gave psychostimulants to hundreds of children, adolescents, 85% of whom were boys, in order to help them to have the organization to be able to cope with what I discovered over the years were academic situations that weren't suited to them. I mean, it's become commonplace now that we understand that boys learn differently than girls. You can't sit a boy at a desk all day and expect him to learn. You have to get him up at some point, run him around the block, or have him, throw a few hoops, and then come back and sit down and he'll learn. Girls, on the other hand, are able to sit placidly and go through this, but it doesn't work for boys. So there's a whole host of different aspects of the way we're currently approaching our boys and our men that don't work.
Yeah, I think, I've noticed with working in Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Little League coaches, etc., that these kids, to your point, especially the boys, you've got all that energy and you've got to burn it off. And it seems like about the same time you were starting to notice some of the depression is when PE was getting cut down in terms of time, if they even offered it, right? Or recess or shop classes, or the things where boys would be assembling things and on their feet and figuring out problems versus sitting at the desk and reading a book or going through a tablet or however they're doing that. And so it seems like, yeah, there's that correlation. And then, we're essentially, it seems like trying to medicate the boys to be passive enough to sit and do something that's against kind of, I don't know, the biology, let's say. What do you think?
Well, when I go out with my wife, we're in restaurants and we're both grandparents at this particular point, but very often we observe families with children. Now, if they have boys and girls, you can always tell who the boys are and who the girls are. The girls are sitting there quietly and the boys are running around the table. It's really funny. Anyone who's listening should just go to any restaurant and watch a family, and they'll be able to tell who the boys are and who the girls are just from their behavior. So it makes sense that the boys have to be understand and managed differently, and not managed in the sense of behave yourself, but hey, you need a little bit of movement to get your wits together.
Absolutely. With the work with the anthropologists, what were maybe some of their observations? Because I think a lot of times, if we go back just a couple of 100 years, as soon as the boys could really walk and start to do things, it was like, go gather firewood, go do these chores, be out in the woods, go do these things. And now that kind of urge and that biological need to be out exploring, taking risks isn't there. And so maybe that's coming through as depression when you're not meeting that need.
Yes, right. The whole work sphere, life sphere for us as humans has changed over the millennia, over the centuries, but in particular in this last 50 years. You and I are sitting quietly in front of screens right now, and most of the boys who, if there's any boys ever watch this, will be watching on a screen, and they will have spent a few more hours watching on a screen. And as a result, they become screen bound, and they forget what it's like to actually do things.
Yeah, I think that's right. From what I've seen too, is they forget the creative side of life as well. I've worked with a number of young men where they might create a little piece of music on the computer and they have this entire backstory, but it never occurred to them to sit down and write it and write why they created a piece of music the way they did. Where I think we used to have to, play, if we were playing Army in the Woods or whatever, we had worlds that were being created in our minds that maybe it's not quite there for the young men today.
That's right. So a loss of direction is a loss of support for the boys and the men, and they wind up being lost boys, lost adolescents, troubled adolescents. They don't do as well as a lot of their peers, and they have this, what I mentioned earlier, is failure to launch. That's a real mystery to parents, because the parents said, I did everything I could. Now, just while we're on the subject of education, as part of my research, I have gone through the curricula of many departments of education. And there are no courses in any department of education that I know of that specifically address the different ways that boys learn. Now, this is really egregious, because teacher education, say at Columbia, for instance, Columbia University here in New York City, one would think that they'd be pioneers in an area where it's a known fact that boys are doing less well by large margins than girls. Why wouldn't that be something that would be special educational courses on, in terms of the needs for teaching boys? But everything got homogenized, and it came out as girl-friendly, not boy-friendly. And because the emphasis has been on women and girls, understandably so, and without any prejudice to them, that's where the money went, the educational directives went. But I think we're paying a very high price.
No, I would agree with that. And, to your point, I would think that young men, young women that are going through and are deciding to pursue careers in education, until they have little boys and little girls on their own, they don't know what an 8-year-old boy's needs are until they have one, or they have that experience.
Until their second child is a boy.
Correct, right.
They say, oh my God, I thought I knew how children worked.
Exactly. Because I think the older teachers that have been parents or grandparents now, they have that understanding because they've had that experience. But, these young people going through Columbia, going through different schools, until you have that hands-on experience, you just don't know. Everything is so theoretical. And so I think those new teachers entering into education are missing that.
All right. Well, Greg, I thought maybe we'd put off talking about depression in fathers around pregnancy to another session. But being a psychiatrist all these years, I've always worked in a very practical way with the people that I've been involved with. That practical way started with, they'd come in and they'd be problems, and they'd ask me what to do, and I'd say, well, that's the last thing we're going to get to. First thing we have to do is understand what's going on. Well, when my first child was born, I'm going to say my first acknowledged child, because I've had a very varied existence, as most men do. It's not a linear path to manhood.
Yes.
My first acknowledged child, I developed a depression. How did it come out? Well, the first thing I noticed was I was hypomanic. I was out of my mind with happiness about it. But that out of my mind with happiness led me to do some indiscreet things. I felt like I could walk on water. But then when I discovered that my wife was unhappy with the pregnancy, even though it was planned, she really hated the condition, that she was depressed, I became depressed. So I ultimately became hypomanic and then depressed in response to this very, very long-awaited pregnancy. Now, at the time, I was in psychoanalysis with a very, very senior doctor, and he never mentioned peripartum depression or postpartum depression. I mean, it was all a behavioral thing. Ed, you gotta behave yourself, I was not behaving myself. And so that stayed with me for a long time. But it wasn't until maybe we're talking 40 years ago now. It wasn't until maybe about 20 years ago that I began to see papers emerging in the literature about depression in men in and around pregnancy. Just an occasional article, because for every occasional article, there were 10 articles on depression in and around pregnancy in women. Well, with my background as an obstetrician, my experience as someone who had peri and postpartum depression, I began to work on this in connection with male studies, because as far as I was concerned, this was the study of the male that I was talking about. This was boots on the ground. This was taking a look at the male lived experience and trying to make sense of it and create systems of support and help. Well, I began by the meta-analysis of the literature on this, on depression in men around pregnancy, and I got quite a bit of information. And then I went to because I was in psychiatry, I went to the local obstetrical doctor in my hospital, and I said to her, I'm working on a paper on postpartum depression in men. Now, she had been working in obstetrics for 30 years. She said, is that a real thing? Okay. So now I said, yeah, it's a real thing. And I said, do you have anything that could help me? She said, well, I have the official questionnaire of the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology that I can give you copies of. Oh, I'd love to see that. So I get a hold of the ACOG questionnaire for the first well-care visit of pregnancy. The man takes his wife to the doctor, and the doctor brings the wife in, and he goes her through a questionnaire and gives her an examination and blah, blah, blah. Then they come out and they say, oh, everything's going well. So when I look at this questionnaire, it doesn't have a single thing about fathers.
That's crazy.
I say, holy mackerel, this is the threshold event of life. And this guy is faced with as many problems as his wife, maybe even more, because he's got to keep himself afloat and keep her afloat too, and keep a kid afloat. So I said, I'm going to create a questionnaire for the first visit to the obstetrical person. And so I set about creating this document called, I say it's a medical legal document called Bringing the Father into Pregnancy. And it mirrors the ACOG form, but it has questions about the father. It asks for his medical history, very important. After all, people might forget it, but there were no babies without male elements. I don't even want to say the word here, sperm. You got to have sperm.
Right.
And that sperm carries half the genetic inheritance of the baby. The baby's going to be half. So I said, but what is this leaving the father out? So I brought the father into pregnancy. And I brought him in a very special way, because reviewing the literature, there are a series of concerns that are of special importance to fathers. I'm going to give you just one right off the top. It's so simple, it's breathtaking. Are you under 25? Any father these days that's under 25 is almost automatically going to be stressed to the point where he's going to have symptoms that can be called postpartum depression. Another one, do you feel you have job security? I just read something the other day about fathers in lower income situations. Very often they're not married, or they were married and they got separated or divorced or whatnot. The questionnaire had to do with how to bring fathers into the family, how to encourage fatherhood. And it started off by saying, well, before you can invite them into a fatherhood program, you want to work to make sure they have employment so that they can, because what the fathers were saying was they didn't feel they could provide for the mother, for the children. And of course, the mothers were upset because they weren't providing. So there were questions like that in this questionnaire that I have for the fathers. Other questions are very obvious, like, is it a planned pregnancy? God forbid it's not a planned pregnancy. I've had one of those. So in other words, these are now here's a good one. Do you feel you have intimacy with your partner? Do you talk to each other? Now this is what I built into this questionnaire. Some of these questions I built into the questionnaire, and I created a little key for it. I said there were 18 questions in the first visit, and I said if you answer yes to 1, 2, or 3, 3 being a threshold, you're more than likely going to have PPD, postpartum depression. I have 8 questions after delivery. If you answer yes to any one of those. You have it. Yes to any one of those. What's the sample question after delivery? Do you have sleep disturbance?
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, I think there was some of that where I was even talking with Jane. It's like, new parents that go through all these changes and everything else, there's going to be some anxiety, some depression, some of these things that are there, but they're going to come out differently for different people. And certainly fathers are going to probably show that stress differently from moms, right?
That's right. They sometimes show it by drinking, fighting, overworking, hanging out with the boys. In other words, getting away from it. So, well, now going back to where I was in 1978, when I had my own postpartum depression, with behave yourself makes it sound like a moral failure. On the other hand, if we begin to look at the symptoms, just as I did in the school for adolescents, look at the symptoms not as a behavioral problem, but as something that had to do with the underlying dynamics, the internal way that the person was experiencing their life at the time, and with special reference to depression. So there has to be a movement for us away from looking at us and telling us to suck it up in effect, and saying if we don't, and we begin doing untoward things or things that don't work for the family, that's bad behavior. Well, bad behavior basically, because as far as I'm concerned, you're a good guy, I'm a good guy, and everybody that walked into my office was a good guy and wanted to do the right thing. All we had to do was see what was going on with him, and we began to understand what he was doing that maybe wasn't the right thing. But that involved understanding rather than blame.
Sure. And did you find too, or have you examined the fact that I think we have a lot less rituals, especially for men that go through these different phases, whether it's adolescence into being young men to being fathers to growing older, than what we used to have? Because it seemed like there were certain thresholds and transition points and things that were very clear. And now it just kind of seems like you're a little boy and you just kind of wander into adolescence and wander into being a young man. And, the next thing you know, you're an old man.
All right. Well, it's as if you're reading my mind, because two of the questions on the bring fathers into pregnancy, one in the before delivery question is, do you have someone you can talk to? And then after delivery, do you feel you have anyone you can talk to? In other words, do you have someone as a man that you feel comfortable talking to? Now, they don't. Men characteristically don't have someone to talk to. The women, they have their way of socializing, and they do share with each other. But men don't tend to do that. So this idea of having someone to talk to is very important. Now, going back a step further, back to what you mentioned about the young men and the adolescents. Well, something like 80% of our teaching force in grade school through high school are female. In other words, there are no male mentors. Now, this is something else. Talking about departments of education, there should be recruitment programs for male teachers, understanding that male teachers are important.
Oh, I agree with that. I've done some substitute teaching. I've done some other kind of work, and it's amazing for me going in and observing some of the classrooms I've been in, just how feminine they are. And it's not I'm not coming after women teachers at all. But when you
want people to keep watching your program?
Yeah. Well, that, and then, but it's something to be aware of, right? Because if I'm a teacher, I'm going to decorate and have things in my room that are going to be kind of reflective of my interests, my color schemes, whatever that is. Well, it's the same thing with the female teachers, but at the same time, the 10-year-old, the 11-year-old, the 12-year-olds, they're seeing more of that side of, I don't know what the right word is. I'm fishing for it, but they're seeing that side of the femininity and not having that teacher, that the male teacher that's in their school schedule, where they go in and it's pictures of baseball or football or whatever it is. And so there's not that balance. And it was one of the things that just kind of struck me.
Stop there a minute, because I have an example that's apropos of this.
Okay.
I went on a consultation to a trade school for automotive repair. And after I saw the shops, I went back with the head of the school, who was a woman. And in her office, by the way, 98% of the students in this enterprise were boys. So I go back to her office, and she has a big poster on her wall. It wasn't Superman. You know who it was? Wonder Woman. So in this automotive school, training school, the head of the school has got a picture of Wonder Woman on her wall in the office. So this goes to exactly what you're saying, that the absence of male energy, male leadership, someone to speak to that can understand some of the actual difficulties of the boys, who understands their needs for a different type of educational experience. This is what we need. This is why male studies is advocating for an academic involvement in this too. Come on, let's get real in terms of the needs of our men and boys. And by the way, everything that I'm saying is not men and boys versus girls and women. I'm not taking anything away from the girls and the women, because, as I said, we walk on two legs. And right now, where we know that we're graduating 60 women with bachelor's degrees for every 40 men we graduate with bachelor's degrees, I asked the question, where are the educated women going to get educated men to marry? So anything that raises the well-being of our boys and our men actually benefits our girls and our women. That's the absolute bottom line here. This is not a zero-sum game. This is a matter of, hey, whatever we do for the one benefits the other, just as I think that what the girls and women have done for themselves over the last 4 or 5 decades has benefited all of us. I think we're a stronger society. I think it may actually be that our consciousness raising that we're involved here in regard to male issues is an outgrowth of the consciousness raising around female issues. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, we're all in this together.
Oh, sure. Well, and it can't do anything but help us understand the needs of both, right? That one's not outshining. To your point, we're not hopping on one leg, but we're walking, ably on two legs that are firm and that we understand the particular needs that each of us have.
Yes.
And one of the questions as we start to get close to wrapping this discussion up is, what can grandfathers, in your opinion, do to help our grandchildren, but then also our adult sons and daughters understand the particular needs that the boys and the young men have?
Well, a little while ago you said there was a difficulty with having people to talk to. And grandfathers are a very special set of, how do we say, mentors in the family situation. They've been there. And very often the youngsters may be more willing to go to grandpa than they are to their own father, because they might be afraid that they'll be judged by their father, whereas grandpa is going to say, well, look, let me see what I can do. So I think grandfathers have a very unique place in our family situation. The problem is there aren't enough of them. Either they got divorced and separated from their kids, or they died. As I said, men die of all causes before women do. But just think about it. I don't know if you had a grandfather in your family. I'm a grandfather, and one of the things that my experience tells me is, even though I've got a 62-year-old daughter, I've got other variations on that, I'm teaching. I'm still teaching. I'm sharing. So that's very important. Hey, save the grandfathers. Save the save the whales. Save the grandfathers.
Absolutely. And, bring back up that group we talked about, that Generations United up there. And one of the things they're doing, just so people remember, is they've got grandfathers going into schools, going into mentorship roles, going into these different things to help those young boys especially figure out life and figure out ways to cope and to grow and to be part of their school community and then their local communities as well. So grandpas, you can also affect other people besides just the grandkids in your own life.
Right.
Now, Ed, as we wrap this up, I know we're probably going to jump back in and revisit some of these topics on a future episode. Was there anything around male studies, anything around some of our discussion points that maybe I didn't ask you, or you want to spend a few more minutes on?
Well, I'm going to tell you what I'd like to get across. I have a website, www.malestudies.org. Just malestudies.org, okay? I just got done rewriting the I said the description of it and the direction of it and the aspirations. And one of the things that I put in, got to the point where we were asking for donations. But what I was asking for was some far-sighted person to create an endowment of, could be tens of millions of dollars, for a dedicated chair of male studies in the Department of Male Studies at a major university. Anyone that does that, it will be a first. And it will be a named chair, so they'll get their name on the chair. Apart from that, though, we limp along on our donations. So anyone who's interested in supporting this Foundation for Male Studies and the work of understanding our boys and men and trying to create more boots on the ground initiatives, just as the Bringing Fathers into Pregnancy, which, by the way, is going to be highlighted at an organizational meeting in July of Postpartum Support International. It's a very, very large group that's been working on this for 30 years. They have offices really quite internationally and lots of workers. And I'm going to be making a major presentation there about this questionnaire for fathers, because it's basically this new medical legal document, Bringing the Father into Pregnancy, changes the whole paradigm. It changes the whole approach. The father becomes an integral part of the whole pregnancy process. Again, as I talk to you, Greg, I'm reprising a life of work. Going back, when I talk about bringing the father into pregnancy, I reprise back to the year 2000 when I put on the conference on the paternal instinct. And I began to understand how we have special draws that bring us both into marriage, into fatherhood, into work. I'll tell a story here. My father was a salesman, and he would get in the car every day and drive around to his accounts. But he also had a very serious medical condition. He had a peptic ulcer that caused him pain all the time. And one day I had the good fortune to be able to drive with him as he went around on his routes. And he had in the little well between the two passenger seats, he had milk and antacids to help him with the pain. And we got into our discussion about it. And he said, Ed, if it wasn't for my family, I wouldn't do this. In other words, he was working through pain the entire time. And it was at that point I realized the intense involvement of the man in his family. My father wasn't sucking it up. He was living it out. He was living out his commitment to his wife and to his 3 sons. And so being a male is a lot of things that haven't been understood, haven't been studied, haven't been appreciated. And we've just been getting, I think, to the point where I think our time has come.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's why we're starting the podcast, right? And talking about grandfathers in particular. And there's enough grandparent podcasts out there, but let's focus in on granddads and our needs.
Well, I think it's we gotta get the boys to be fathers and get the fathers to be grandfathers and keep them alive and keep them well. And I think these are very difficult times.
Absolutely. Ed, what we'll do is we'll put all the links that we had mentioned into the show notes as well. So if somebody's just listening while they're mowing the lawn or whatever, they'll be able to go there and find the links to, your foundation and your work, as well as PSI. And, hopefully the people down in the Louisiana area or Southeast that maybe not signed up for that conference yet in July can make it over there and meet you and learn what we can do to support each other through some of these trials that we have.
Okay.
So, well, thank you so much, Ed, for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. This has really been a fun conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I hope I qualify as a cool grandpa.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you again for all the awesome information you shared with us.
I can't wait to meet you again and do some more and just kind of bring our consciousness up to speed on this.
Absolutely.